Welcome again to our final session for this lecture series. Thank you all for joining us this early afternoon, and it sounds like weather is great everywhere. So thank you for staying inside for a little bit as we have our conversation. So again, welcome to our last session of the lecture series. Today, our topic is going to be focused on what does it mean to live in a democracy. So we have a special guest speaker here with us today, and I'm excited to introduce Dr. Staci Madden from the University of Connecticut. He is an assistant professor in urban and community studies at the University of Connecticut. He holds a BA in humanities from New York University, MAs in history from Brooklyn College and CUNY, and political science from the University of Connecticut. In 2008, he earned his doctorate in education from the University of Hartford. His scholarly interests include community theory, social movements and change, social capital, power dynamics, and the history of education. Thank you, Dr. Madden, for joining us here today for our conversation about what does it mean to live in a democracy.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime. So I will let the audience know sort of the focus of our conversation today, and then we're going to get started with our questions. Like we have in the past, there are a few core questions that we're going to examine here today, letting the audience know what they are first. The first one is, what is citizenship? What does it mean to be a citizen? What is the role of community? And what is the role of our leaders? All right, so that's the focus and the key areas of our conversation today. So let's get started. So, Dr. Madden, what does it mean? What is citizenship? What does that mean?
Well, I always go to Peter Block and talk about accountability and whether one is accountable or whether one is holding others accountable. So, for instance, if we're going to put into context the Ukrainian-Russian situation, crisis. Are we doing anything to be accountable to that community, or are we holding Vladimir Putin accountable? And these are things that I think at the end of the day, when we're talking about citizenship, we're talking about what it's like to be a citizen. It's like, how are you accountable to your community? How are you accountable rather than holding others accountable, rather projecting blame and suggesting what others, are at fault or who's at fault? What are you doing? I recently had noticed a bunch of signs around posters that students were putting up around campus at UConn, chastising the new interim president for her involvement in Israel or had something to do with that. And that was an example of holding her accountable rather than being accountable. So I think that as a citizen, we have to be able to, find a way to sort of enter into collective possibilities. I think that reciprocity is a big part of this too, and not when we're talking about being, generalized reciprocity is, doing something without expecting anything in return, giving of ourselves, participating. Social capital becomes very important. So all of these things I think are very important to the definition of citizenship. Whether or not, they are followed through is probably another story entirely.
And one of the things that I was thinking about as you were providing that explanation is, there's so many different ways to participate, but what does that look like, right? Oftentimes I hear about this, posting on social media. Is that enough? Are we good citizens by doing? Is that helpful? Is it not? What are some ways that we can be accountable or that we can participate in this kind of larger conversation as citizens? And now with social media being so as popular as it is, that is one tool that can be used. But historically, what we've seen is more what you described of individuals posting things on college campuses, right? Or sharing flyers, things of that nature.
I don't know if I would, social networking is important, but social media, I stopped, participating in social media altogether because I feel like it's more of a one-way conversation and stating facts and you're not stating facts, but stating a version of the facts. And again, I think you hear about a lot of holding others accountable rather than being accountable. one of the issues of when it comes to citizenship is the importance of social networks, and those are important. How do we find out where we can get involved, who we can get involved with, what are the causes, what are the needs, how do we establish and understand what social capital is, what are the needs of the community, but simply criticizing and holding others accountable is not necessarily what I would deem to be important as a citizen or as a member of a community.
So what are some effective ways that we can
Well, I
engage?
mean, go to a town hall meeting. I mean, there are things which you can do, go to a community center. I think that, I had students who did a project years ago where they were supposed to, the assignment was to establish what is your ideal community. And I was amazed at the number of who came up with churches and looked at church as the place where people could gather and discuss. I, going to my daughter's soccer games on the sidelines, talking with other people about, what were the needs of the community? What do we need to do? And had more conversations with other members of my community than anybody was really interested in the soccer game.
Mhm.
It was any place you can find gathering, you have to have a place where people can come together and discuss. Block again, Peter Block talks about these 6 different type of conversations. If you can change the conversation, you can change the context, but you have to be involved in the conversation. What is the conversation? And we'll get to this later, but leadership, I think there's a lot of deferment to leadership. Okay, well, leadership is going to take care of everything. We'll just vote for this guy or this woman, and they will fix everything for us. It's the sort of deference to others that they will take care of our problems, and we don't have to do much. Well, you still have to be a participant. So you ask, where can we get together? Well, college campuses are great places. Anywhere where you can have an exchange of ideas, where you can come together. There has to be a shared interest. There has to be a shared activity. There has to be, for instance, if you live in a neighborhood where there is not a place for your children to go play, well, how do you get that? How do you build a playground? How do you put that together? What do you need? What are the materials? What are the labor? What are the laws? What are the, what's permits? All of this type of things. But people have to come together to build those things. PTA meetings, PTA meetings, I think they're so called. Those types of things. Go and get active in your community and be a part of that conversation.
That makes me think of the quote, right? Or the saying, all business is local, right? All politics is local, right? So I think oftentimes, and I think this will go to our conversation a little bit later, but oftentimes we look at the big picture, the national picture, right? To your point about we elect a leader, but how many things actually are really supported in our local communities, and do we actually know what's happening in our local communities unless you go to a town hall meeting or gather together as a community? I'd make the argument I'm seeing less of that, right? Especially in my local community. Is there sort of that trend now that people are not getting as involved, instead looking at one bigger picture? Perhaps.
Well, I think the American culture is very individualistic anyway. I mean, I don't think that there is we do everything that we can. And when I say we, I talk about the sort of the power of we, or we who are in power, which is not me. Those who, put out this that collectivism is bad. Collectivism means socialism. It means communism. You can't work together. You have to think about yourself. What's in it for me? All of these types of things. I mean, the indoctrination of success as an individual thing is something that, is ideologically a battle, something we have to overcome. And the only way to do that, and you mentioned national politics, I think that we get involved in national politics when in reality, I don't know that national politics actually has a lot to do with us locally. I don't know that it has an impact on us locally unless you are looking at tax policy. Most local policies are not that affected by national politics. They're just not, they are, people do have the power to change things. They do have the power to change their local communities. They have to choose to do so. They have to choose to be involved. And we get distracted. I think national politics is a distraction. It's because it's, a little bit sexier than maybe local politics might be. But local politics is local issues are where we exist. But we tend to pay attention. I think that the most recent thing, and there's nothing to do with politics, but the Will Smith slap thing happened, and everybody was focused on that, when in reality, it's probably the only time you're ever going to see a black man be able to commit a felon on national television and not get arrested. I mean, there's an area, there's a part of our society that many of us will never be a part of, but it's that part of our society and our general, not our community, but our society, that we are more focused on. And we'll live in that. We're never going to be invited to that room of 300 people. And this has been a tradition in American culture for a long time. We go back, we started out with a society of white male landowners, right? And if you had influence, you got invited to the decision-making process. You got invited to those things. And that's what sort of creates this national identity that we seem to focus on.
So, a couple things you said there, national politics may be more interesting than making sure we have a playground, right? In our local community, might be more attractive, right? But I think that also ties into what you were saying in the beginning about our own accountability, right? It's easier to look at somebody else and not sort of think about what we can do on the local level, or, within our own community. So is pulling our attention that way taking away from our personal accountability?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I think it is. And I think that's intentional. I think it's intentional to sort of to be distracted. I always ask my students this: if you're a person in power, would you want 100% of the people voting for you? Would you want 30% of the people voting for you? And most often, I think the answer is probably I want 30%, because if I only need to make 30% of the people happy or focus on their interests, my job is not as difficult. Right. And usually I share those type of interests with that 30% rather than the interest of the remaining 70%. So I do think it's a distraction. Peter Block also, and I use him a lot, him and John McKnight, say that this is the marketing of fear and fault. The marketing of fear and fault is always giving us somebody to look at. What's the other that we need to worry about? I think the most recent thing I heard is that, Governor Abbott in Texas is putting all of the illegal immigrants on a bus and sending them to Washington. I don't really know what that does or how that serves anything, but that's what he's doing. And so it's a distraction. We need to be afraid of these people because they're our problem, or we need to be afraid of this, or, whatever. I mean, there's always the marketing of fear and fault. Thank you, Diana.
Which, this morning, and I was talking about the scapegoat theory in sociology, right? Something that we've seen time and time again. Instead of looking individually of what's happening, another group is at fault, right? So we've seen this throughout history of blaming a different group for what is happening. So does that do all of these topics that we're talking about end up dividing us instead of bringing us together, which you already started to talk about, and goes to our second question, is really what is the role of community at this, in this conversation? What is the role of community in our world, in our democracies?
Well, I think that any community, and this is, if you're going to go back to, Ferdinand Tonis, who wrote, all about, community, and created the Gemeinschaft and the Gesellschaft, the community versus the society. What is the best, role for community, or what is the definition of community? And he always looked at this having a shared set of values, and what is the relationship between a society and a community? Is a society made up of a community or many different communities, or do the different communities serve the society? Which is the relationship? One of the things that Tony's talked about was that as society got bigger, and you looked at a lot of things in terms of technology and advancement, and this was very popular during the Industrial Revolution, was were we losing our community values and our identities to serve a bigger system? Is that when you move from community to system, or you move from community to society, what were you taking into the society to make it better, or were you being shaped by the society and losing what you had in the community? So I do think that the role of the community, and he would argue this, is that the role of the community is to shape those values, having some traditional understanding of who you are and where you come from, and family is certainly something that we do live in. I think we live in a society, and I run into students who, and my own children, who think this is that when will the day come when I can leave the house and get as far away from you as possible? And I think that's a product of what Tony's just talking about, is that we want to leave behind what it is, where we came from, to get to the big time. And is that something that, are we struggling with that? And I think that's a very good question. I think it's a good question for us to ponder and consider. What is the role that community plays in our life? And, we are, in terms of community, you can come up with a lot of different definitions for community. We all have a home community. We all have a work community. We all have a professional communities. We have all of these different communities, but where do they, how do they establish and develop who we are, and what pieces? Block talks about this too, about fragmentation, all different silos in society. Like you have the church silo, you have the educational silo, you have the government silo. You have all these different silos, and you're creating more fragmentation, that serves a society rather it does actually maintains any sort of community.
And one of the things that's making me think about is even the current, Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? Where even if we're talking here, right, meaning being in Connecticut, we're still siloed in communities. And I'm speaking from the perspective of being from the Polish diaspora community, right? Because that's my community. I know how large it is. I know what the resources are. I know the connections to the Ukrainian community here. But if you're not within that silo, within that group, are you aware of the concerns? Are you aware of the problems? Are you aware of the successes, right? And until, something like this happened, the conversations start happening. So, our silos preventing us from understanding each other until a crisis happens, perhaps.
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think that's the divorce between community and society. I mean, where, and this is what Tony's talking about. I think what you see in Ukraine is many small independent communities unaware of these larger debates and problems. And a lot of times, I mean, if you tune out from the national news, which I tried to do repeatedly, it's a matter of, there's two separate debates going on. There's one for those in power, and there's the rest of us. There's the rest of us who sort of, figure out, what does it mean for us to live every day without, this impending doom. And I remember the reaction by most Ukrainians before the attack was they never really thought it was going to happen. There was this majority of, most regular people on the ground being like, well, and even, expats who were living in the Ukraine were sort of like, Americans. I don't think this is going to happen. What good reason would there be to happen? And then it did, and now we've seen the destruction. So there's always sort of that disconnect. And I think that's sort of, that's a problem. It is, I think Diana just put a comment in about the tug and pull between the two. We're constantly caught in the middle of that.
Which, we're constantly caught between the different parts of our identity, right? And the different communities that we all inhabit, or subcultures, right? As a sociologist would put, right? And how we're playing our roles every day, because, also conversely, a lot of the members of the Ukrainian community that I've spoken to, they're like, we've been saying this since 2014. Why didn't anyone listen to us, right? We've been fighting what's been happening since 2014. So, again, depending on what community we're talking to, right? Because even if we take, an ethnic group like Ukraine, right, or Poles, or, whichever, they're all going to have different perspectives based on even their geographic location, right? Saying I'm Polish, but I'm Polish American. I can't say I'm Polish born in Poland, right? My spouse, who was born in Poland but has now lived most of his life in America, he can't really even identify as fully Polish, right? And even just that perspective is also going to change how we view community and where our thought, I wonder if our thought processes are as well, and perspectives. So there's always this sort of push and pull and tug between our different identities. And what does that mean to our communities? Because a lot of our communities too, in which we identify, are really tied down back to values. What do we value, and what does that community value, and how does that align between ourselves and that actual community? So how many communities do we inhibit or, work with on a daily basis? As you mentioned, we have our home communities, we have our work communities. For me, those are two different worlds.
Yeah, but which one can we really be ourselves in, and which one is reflective of who we really are, and where do we feel safest? I don't feel safe in my work community. I don't feel I can express, my feelings about education unless I'm around people who share those same values with me. I mean, so it's difficult, at home, I'm safest because, probably I'm around my children. But when I, walk out the door and I, see political signs on people's yards, I know that I don't share some of those opinions. So I don't know. I think identity is a very important thing, because I think Americans in general struggle with this idea of identity, because I think we live in a social hierarchy that suggests that the further back your family goes in America, the more American you are. I think that nativism is a big, big, big problem, and rears its ugly head an awful lot from one generation to the next. And so I don't know. We do not have the history. We do not have this history of like a feudal history, to where, we go back and there's, a dark ages or a monarchy that we, needed to come out from under. And I think that Europeans, you'll have a different sense and a different appreciation for what they have than maybe Americans do, because Americans, had never had to overcome, a history of, of despotism. They did not have, all they needed to do was to, and we have a very hard time. I think we in general, I think as a culture, have a difficult time with heterogeneity, because we move, we talk about siloing, we, seem to be more comfortable, in heterogeneous communities that share our values. And I think these are the things that Tony's was getting to.
Diana just asked a question. Do we identify as citizens? Do we embrace the accountability that resides with that concept, right? Because, even to our earlier conversation, to be a citizen, it very simply put means to do things, right? If we want to kind of simplify it, to do things. And are we doing the things?
I don't, I would probably say for the most part, no. Maybe not. I think people identify citizens as people who vote, but I would identify people as citizens, people who do. Right? What do you do? What do you give? What do you give of yourself? How do you? We also live in a very monetary culture, to where if I give of myself, what am I going to get? Nothing's worth doing unless you get paid for it. And that probably is one of the crux that gets in our way. Just my own colleagues, I've heard this, I'm not going to do that because I don't get paid for it. This summer, for instance, I'm working at Spring Valley Farm in stores with students who are doing an internship for the summer. They're getting paid. I don't get paid, but it's a great teaching opportunity. It's a way to give of myself too. So, not to toot my own horn, but that's the type of thing I think we need to start thinking about, is how do we give of ourselves to make, if we want to make the world better, we can do that. I have a student who's, currently running a campaign for the needy and Ukrainian refugees in Poland. And he decided to do this all by himself. I mean, he's being accountable, but he's not holding others accountable. Right. And he's, putting this thing together and pulling his campaign together, figuring out which ways. He's got to go through a lot of red tape. I never know how much red tape you have to go through in order to make donations. Right. And so, I mean, I think it was Jane Addams once said, if you need a word like charity, you don't really have a democracy. Right. Because the two sort of don't, they should automatically go together. Right. But if you're in if you're calling yourself a democracy and you need charity and you're always fighting to get some level of charity to happen, maybe you don't really have a democracy.
Interesting point. All right. John is asking, how do we teach the importance of altruism in the fold of being a citizen?
I mean, I'm sorry, roll.
Okay, I just wanted to
bad finger right here.
Aren't you an English teacher too? So how do we teach, right? So we have a lot of educators who are on with us, right? Professors at various institutions. How do we teach the importance of altruism and the role of being a citizen? Or, I said educators, but what about even our family members, our communities that we all engage with?
That's a huge question, and that's a great question. But I mean, I think I agree with Diana. Is that does altruism truly exist? I mean, are we doing a true altruism? It does not have, there's not a reward to it. Like you do it because you want to do it. Like years ago, I had somebody say to me, listen, if you do a good deed, it only counts if you don't tell anybody about it. And I agree with that. And I was working at NYU at the time, and there used to be this blind man who would need to cross the street, and he would just stand there and wait for somebody to cross him. And I would go out there and I would help him across the street, and it would kill me the rest of the day that I couldn't tell anybody. I'd have to do everything in my power not to tell everybody. Oh, look what I did. Because you want that, we kind of like want to need that credit or something. So altruism is you just give of yourself. I think teachers are probably the closest thing. Good teachers and teachers who give of themselves are probably understand altruism better than anybody else, because if they're in the right place, they're mostly concerned with shaping and helping that student to learn. Right. So in education, the biggest challenge is, we're in a culture, especially in higher ed. Are we there to teach and get people to learn? Or we're preparing them to get a job? Is this about knowledge or certification? And I think that's something that we have to battle every day. When you ask a question in class, and you get nothing from your students, is that their fault, or are they conditioned not to speak up because they're afraid, or because they don't want to disagree with the instructor? When I did my dissertation research, I interviewed a student, and she said, college is not about learning. It's about surviving. And if I survive for 4 years, I can get a job. So what's the easiest way for me to survive?
And, I'll add to that. And then I just saw Michelle made a comment, but what I'll add to this point, right? Are the demands of society letting us do these things, right? Again, simply put, for example, again, proud millennial, just recently going through my doctorate and all of that. The demands on having to work while getting my education is exhausting. And there's many things I would love to do and did not get a chance to do because of the demands on my time. So are we setting up a system where we can or cannot be altruistic?
Well, I don't think neoliberalism is something that, really cares about altruism. I think that, and this is Noam Chomsky talking, but, Chomsky would say that, the neoliberalist version of higher ed is to indoctrinate, and are we indoctrinating, or are we, I'm, currently working on, I answered a call for papers on utopianism. And the utopianism that I see on university campuses now, especially where I teach, is students creating groups where they can learn stuff that they're not learning in classrooms? How do they teach themselves? How do they create, how can they do altruism? Can they create, community partners? What can they do to make the world a better place? Because they're not really necessarily being taught that. And that's kind of upsetting. Well, kind of, it is upsetting.
And Michelle added, I don't think it does, because even if you don't tell anyone, you're motivated and rewarded by internally feeling good about what you did. And just to make sure, because I know we moved on talking about altruism, correct, Michelle? Right. So how are we conditioned, right? Whether it's higher ed or something else, right? So this is really going to the behavior part of our conversation, right? About the role of community in our own individual behaviors, right? As a sociologist, I would argue so many factors are going into that conversation, but I think one thing we're not talking about is also shared goal, right? What would be a purpose of doing something, right? And do we need goals in order to achieve some sort of efforts? Do we need, which we'll get to leadership in a second, but what's the role of leadership, in any kind of community efforts?
I like what Block and McKnight do with this too, and they talk about gifts. What are the gifts that people have? And that everybody's glass should be half full, not half empty. And when we look at everybody else, what do you have to contribute? And that's how I teach, in class I do this, it's like, what do you think about this? I don't care if, there's no right answer, and, Rousseau going back, to the Enlightenment would, talk about the general will. How is the general will, how does, if you sign a social contract and you're involved in a social contract, how does that social contract reflect a general will? Or does it, if it reflects the interest of somebody else or an oligarchy or an individual, and then you're just a slave. You're not in a community. So I think that sharing those gifts, and then, another part of this, John Rawls would say, that, okay, it's my duty as a citizen to where if my glass is full, to empty out half of it to bring somebody up to my level. Right. And those things are what, listen, as a teacher, I know where I'm going to be in 10 years. I'm going to be here with a whole nother group of students, but they're not. Most of them are going to be out and they're going to be trying to do what they do. Do we want the world to change? Or do we want it to just stay the way it is? If we want it to stay the way it is, then, then I guess there's nothing wrong with the world. So I think altruism and teaching it, if we're back to altruism, I know you're asking about leadership, but the recognition that everybody has something to contribute should be, at the forefront. Everybody's glass is half full.
What role can everyone play and contribute into a common cause, right? So perhaps, we also discussed before we got on this, kind of to the question of goals, right? How communities can unite under shared experiences, right? And specifically, we talked about shared tragedies, which may also, back to the question or the comment that we had about push and pull with communities, how do shared experiences also bring communities together, this sense of knowing? One of the things why, some more context on the comment, right? I think I had shared this with you in our earlier conversation, as things were happening recently with Russia and Ukraine, I went into this mode of like knowing what to do, right? I knew how to coordinate resources. I knew how to do all of these things. And I caught myself thinking, how did I know this? Well, I'm the granddaughter of a World War II survivor. I watched her send packages to Poland in the 80s under communism. Most of my childhood was, gathering things for my cousins in Poland who didn't have shoes or candy bars or any of those things. And we'd go to, okay, if anybody is from Connecticut, the JCPenney warehouse in Manchester, anybody recall that one, right? We would go there and buy all of these things and ship it to Poland. And I remember doing this as a child. And now, as things are unfolding, how did I know how to do that? And she's been gone 12 years. How do shared experiences or shared tragedies shape our communities as well?
Well, we just saw that Black Lives Matter. The shared sense of tragedy, people rallying around tragedy and having that experience of tragedy, and sharing a shared value of, why does this continue to happen? Somebody gets shot and, everybody rallies around that. And, not to get into a larger conversation of whether or not, what role the police had in that or didn't have in that. But the fact is that there was a shared tragedy. There's a shared tragedy if you go back to Japanese internment after World War II. I mean, we do have, that is important. I mean, and that feeling as a community, of somebody who, what is that shared sense of tragedy? 9/11 was probably another, the last time I remember it. There is, what experience do, and how do we feel and go through something together? There's a national, what do you call it? The Me Too movement, another shared tragedy, another shared sense of experience. But the problem is that we move on from these very quickly. We sort of, we have our little, there's a societal sort of tragedy. Well, what are the community tragedies, and how are those communities and how do they continue? John McKnight also talks about stories as being very essential to community, and understanding those stories, sharing those stories, relating that sense of tragedy, that this is how we are all interconnected. It's based on, we went through this together. So I do think that that's very important.
And one thing, and this is very much a thought as a sociologist, I don't have the answer to my next statement, right, by any means, but that also makes you think how shared tragedies bond a community, but can also contribute to a silo, right, to another community, right? So it can bond and we can become more siloed because it's safe, or it's because what we know and you don't understand, right? How is that also shaping our experiences and understanding one another, right? How is that shaping our experiences in sharing stories, right? Because we know sharing stories is the best way to communicate, right? We start this early, right? Early childhood. What do? We read stories, right? We share stories. We love stories as humans, right? We love sharing stories. And it's whose stories are getting amplified and whose are not, and who's telling the story is always the key aspect of this, right? But what is important, I think, is that what we do after the coming together to prevent further tragedies. In this country, we don't seem to gel in action. And Diana, Ken, I believe that there are those who believe that the action will bear no fruit. So do we feel helpless? How quickly, to your point, Staci, we forget? And how quickly do we move on, right?
I agree with both points. I'm just waiting for what's the question here? I mean, is that, I get it. How much of this is cultural? I mean, what needs to change is, and how does that change go on, or how does it happen is such a big question. I do think that, community involvement is probably the best place to start, in terms of, becoming active and doing things in your community that, are create a better way to live and create, better standards, better values. But it's a big task. It is a big task. A lot of it is cultural, though, I do believe. As
Michelle sort of reinforces, Ken, if we take that back to what it means to be a citizen, we would be acting continuously, right? Would we have the opportunity to forget, or would we be supporting each other, right? I'm now adding to Michelle's statement. I read her statement and then sort of started adding my own, right? Would we have the opportunity to forget, right? For example, like, I know this made me think of in the Polish community, right? There's certain community members that will still talk about World War II, right? 2 reasons: to never forget, and to talk about stories that haven't been shared now 70, 80 years later. Okay. Diana.
There is a human condition too, I think, that, we live in social hierarchies. And, understanding that nobody is really more important than the next person is a condition. And can we achieve that? I don't know. I don't think that, we have progressed in human history that far. I think that, we still are controlled by we call them oligarchies in Russia. Here we call them entrepreneurs. I don't know necessarily that there isn't a group of influential intellectuals who consider themselves to be far more important than everybody else. That defeats community. That defeats citizenship.
Which I think that we've also been socialized or conditioned to listen, right? And
that's what I mean.
Yeah, and we've allowed that division, right? I truly believe I truly believe the Margaret Mead quote. As a sociologist, I do think the only thing that will change the world is a committed group of citizens, right? It's obviously not verbatim right now, but if you look at social movements and social change, people make the change, but people have to get together on a common goal to make the change. And if we're divided, are we able to make any social change happen? And conversely, social change happens every day. We have changed the world so much in the last 10 years, even if it's not visible. We change it every day in small ways. So social change is this interesting thing of moving slow and fast at the same time. I know we're kind of, go ahead.
I might push back on that a little bit.
Okay.
I think that we are kind of like the clock in elementary school that goes up 2 minutes and comes back 1 minute. I don't know that, I think social change is addressed, but, there are groups of people in our culture, who still struggle in the same ways in which they struggled 50 years ago.
So Michelle adds, and without goals, the change isn't sustainable, right? And I think Ken had made this comment earlier. I did lose track of it in the comments about, I'm kind of going back, making sure our younger citizens are the ones taking on. So how would we lose social change, to your point, Staci, if we don't mentor the next people to take it over, right? If we don't share the history, if we don't share the story, if we don't share the progress, we may be seeing a lot of that right now with a lot of the laws that are changing in different states in regard to abortion, right? We are seeing a lot of this conversation, right? That's happening. I'm sorry?
Or book banning.
Book banning, right? We're seeing these, unfortunately, what we're seeing is not new, right? To me, we've seen this before, but if we're not sharing it, we're not sustaining it, and we let it go as humans, are we providing the opportunity for it to happen again? I don't have the answer to that question. These are the things that, keep me up. Well, they don't keep me up at night, but I think about.
Well, I take the attitude that the only way I can change the world is one student at a time, and that's it. But I know the pressure that they're under, and this again goes back to the neoliberalist doctrine of, we saddle our students with so much debt that they almost have to, when they get out, they almost have to go to work for, some sort of element in the system. It's very difficult for them to go out and, work for a nonprofit, when they're saddled with this much debt. And also getting them to think, I think that, one of the things we can do as instructors, as teachers, as professors, whatever it is to allow them to speak and allow them to learn and to challenge us and to, these doctrines that, the literature that we have them to read, and not regurgitating everything all the time. What do you actually think? You read this book, what do you think of it? What is your, getting them to begin to formulate opinions and feelings and emotions about things that they're going to face inevitably, rather than, I know what I think. I'm 53 years old. I know what I think about the world. I don't really need them to think the same thing that I think. I need them to, to be able to have the confidence to go out in the world and challenge it.
So what are the skills we're teaching? Because I hear a lot about critical thinking, and I did see a conversation piece about civics. I as a sociology professor, every time we get to the politics and government chapter, every semester they're like, Dr. W, we're not talking about this because they think it's going to be so, polarizing. And I'm like, we're just talking about how the system works. And at the end of this class, every time they're like, why didn't anyone teach us this?
Why didn't anybody what?
Why hasn't anyone taught us this? Mm-hmm. How the system works? And that's personally terrified me for a number of years. I want to just quickly get to our question. We do only have a few more minutes, but I want to get to our last question about what is the role of leaders, right? We did touch upon this throughout our conversation, right? But we started our conversation talking about individual choice, individual action, individual accountability. But what is the role of our leaders? I would make the same argument that a lot of times we're looking to the leaders to fix things or to take care of it. What is their actual role?
Romanticize leadership. That's a problem. I think leaders are, the role of leadership has is to facilitate, is to get a conversation going, to start a conversation, but not necessarily to finish it. Let people start to talk about things that are important to them. And if you have to set them off, I always use this in classes that, the best, how change really happens for our culture is that somebody convinces you that, well, yeah, change is necessary. You may not have known that before, but yeah, we need to have change. And then after they get you to, your appetite wet for the change, they then present you with the solution to that change, which is going to serve them. So I think that you can't have that agenda walking into it. I think leaders need to be able to say, okay, listen, this is a problem. How do you want to fix it? And get that going, get that started, because people look to leaders to do the changing for them. And that doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And, I think Michelle just said that leaders should inspire people to do, that's very much important. That's important. They should be the ones who I always say this about, the civil rights movement. Would we have a civil rights movement without Martin Luther King? I think so. I think Martin Luther King was a very good facilitator of what needed to be done and allowed others to get it done. We don't want to get a big conversation about MLK, but there are movements that do happen that leaders could be catalysts, but I don't know necessarily need to be solvers.
JFK, as Ken says, JFK asks not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Seems to be the theme of our conversation. So what is, one of the things too that's making me think about in this exchange is what about the role of power, right? I agree, leaders should inspire you to do the work and want you to do the work, right? But what happens if you have a leader who just wants the power? We're seeing this, right? We see this a lot in our society today.
Well, that's because we have a social hierarchy. Because people want to get to. I'll just read Animal Farm. There's a reason. Why people want. That's a social construction. I don't know. I think that there's a difference between the power to and the power over. The power to is, when you are able to inspire somebody else, you're able to build their confidence, get them, to be empowering them. And then the power over is just control.
I'll say two things. Since you mentioned Animal Farm, I will reference our lecture 2 weeks ago, and Dr. Brian Dixon is joining us here today, where we reviewed the film Mr. Jones, and the reference throughout that movie is about the writing of Animal Farm and the story of Mr. Jones and how it's parallel, I guess I will say, to Animal Farm, right? So again, thank you, Brian, for joining us here today and continuing on the theme of our conversations. But one thing I'll add to what you just said about leaders is that also requires a lot of, individual reflection too, for someone who's in it, in a leadership position. Does that also entail what is their responsibility, even on the individual level, to keep that sort of power in check, so to speak?
Well, don't be an idiot. Number one, that would be it. But, are they in it? Do they get in it to serve themselves or to serve others? I don't really, you're asking me to, I can't get into the head of somebody who's manipulated power, because I just don't have, I don't understand how you can do it. I don't understand if you're in a position to help somebody, you choose not to. That's foreign to me. And I see that every single day. I see it all the time in all walks of life. You're in a position to move mountains and you just won't do it. That's what the power to do is about, not the power over. I don't know. I think that there's a personal responsibility there, that if you're going to get into a position of leadership, that you sort of have a Hippocratic oath not to harm other people. And if you can't do that, you shouldn't be a leader.
Absolutely. Which is, it's interesting you bring up.
I should say, if you can't do that, you're not a leader.
Right. And which is interesting that you bring up the example of the Hippocratic Oath, right? It is true in many professions, there's oaths, very detailed oaths, like the Hippocratic Oath. But in leadership, we actually don't see much of like that accountability as well. So, one of the things as we sort of come to a close on our conversation, it seems like a full circle conversation about, as citizens, it's about personal responsibility and accountability, especially as you rise into the ranks of leadership and power, right? At whatever stage that might be. You may be a local leader. You may be the person that is getting the playground built in your neighborhood. That also brings power, right? That also brings opportunity. So
Right.
what are some ways to ensure power?
I don't know that the power of getting that built is the power that you have. Nobody builds it themselves.
No.
But there is a sense of, nobody can start the conversation and let it go after that. But when you need to be in control of everything, that's sort of an abuse of power. You're not, you don't have the power to anymore. You have the power over.
So as Diana is putting in, the democracy exercises your right to advocate. So really, this turns into our conversation about advocacy. Any questions before we wrap up? I know we've had a really robust conversation and a lot of great points in the chat box. Does anybody have any questions or anything they would like to add as we start wrapping up? Oh, now we're quiet. Now we're all quiet.
I would offer one last little cap.
Sure, absolutely, Staci.
Thing here is that, I think that if we're going to teach, and this is something I learned from my mentors at Hartford, and that is one of which is here today, is that, we need to start, equating leadership with power and how we teach it, and that just because you're a leader doesn't mean you're powerful. Right. You may have some abilities, but, leading is about guiding, about, it's a different thing. I mean, it's not, this whole thing of we equate them. So, well, if you're going to be, you want to lead so you can get power. Well, no. And I would just say that, that's something to consider.
Absolutely.
Question.
Yeah. So Staci, you said something really important before when you mentioned power over and power with. And I think the key thing here is recognizing you have power to act with others and to act for and on behalf of others. And you mentioned, the individual who was blind that you would help cross the street. I grew up in a town where there were a set of twins that were much, much older. They're as old as my parents were, and, that same kind of experience. And I think, shared power with those twins, being able to, say to these big adults, hi, I can help you cross the street. And, and that mutual, you talked about reciprocity. And so there's reciprocity there because, Lisa, you talked about your grandmother and learning from her, and then that idea of paying it forward. There's nothing more important than understanding that we live in a country where every single individual can make a difference, and they can make a difference at the local level through various forms of advocacy and engagement. And they can make a difference at the national level by, I forget, Lisa, if it was you or Staci who mentioned storytelling, telling a story, presenting the facts, and engaging with your representatives. It does work. It's amazing. And you do have personal power. And the issue is to exercise that power to make the difference.
Any other last thoughts or questions? And Ken, I will get to your question in 1 second too. I just want to make sure if anybody wants to add anything or ask a question. Okay. Okay. So as we wrap up, right, Ken asked the question, Lisa, what are, John just distracted me. I'm sorry, Ken, I'm trying to read your question too. Lisa, what are you going to offer next? This is great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming and for giving us your time today in these important conversations. And I've seen many of you in all 4 sessions. So thank you for attending our sessions. We do plan on continuing these sessions through the summer months. So currently I am working on that. I will really update the information very soon. We're just at final, to be completely honest, we're at finals week. We're just trying to get through finals right now, but we will continue the conversation in the summer. What we will do is have themes each time that we run this. In the summer, our theme will be focused on our immigrant communities, specifically in New England. And again, back to storytelling and sharing stories, right? So very similar theme or continuation of that. So if you do have any questions, I'm going to put my email. I don't think this was ever shared, but if you have any questions about the series, oh, I didn't. I will send that to everybody. If anybody has any questions or any feedback or anything, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to share. And as soon as we have the program ready, which I do anticipate to have very, very soon, I will share that with the group. So thank you all for attending. I really appreciate your time. I hope that the series was helpful in sort of sharing information and resources about this particular topic. But a lot of how it was designed is not just on the current crisis in Ukraine. It is also topics that relate to our everyday lives, much like today, right? And how do we continue this conversation? And Brian, thank you very much. Thank you for joining. And thank you, Brian, for speaking 2 weeks ago. I learned a lot about film through our process and our conversation.
And thanks, Staci, for making time, because I know you are busy at UConn, so we really, really appreciate you.
Oh, anytime.
Say that on
It'll be
behalf,
fun.
as the dean of the school, we really appreciate you giving the time.
Well,
Amazing depth and breadth of information that we should continue to tap as we move forward. So thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Staci, for joining us and for sharing your insights. Thank you all for joining us here today. And I look forward to seeing you in the summer. Enjoy the break that you will receive from us from now. And I do look forward to seeing you in a late spring and early summer. I will stay back if you have any questions or want to ask anything specifically, but otherwise have a lovely day.